Everybody on your team should know 3 things about any topic, but especially about AI. 1 is what's expected, 2 is what's allowed, and 3 is what's possible. There are some conversations about performance reviews in AI and them sometimes saying our organization is now including this on our performance reviews, AI proficiency. How are we going to articulate that? And those 3 questions can be helpful to do it because what's expected can be what tools can you use, what can't you use, all over the place. If you're not having very candid and very structured conversations around AI, then you have team members that have never used it because they have no idea how to use it or use it effectively. And so thinking about what's expected, what are those general guardrails, but then also in the what's allowed and what's possible, one of the things I think can be helpful is to find people that are using AI in really good ways. The real value to me is using it to actually be better. So as a manager, what are scenarios I'm going to face? What are some of the questions I should ask and some support I can realistically give? It can help to have that back and forth conversation and be an outlet that people do feel more comfortable asking those back and forth questions.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where we explore the mindset, skills, and strategies that leaders need to grow influence that truly matters. In today's workplace, managers are expected to do more with less certainty, less direction, and often less support, while still delivering results through people. My guest for this episode has built a practical framework for exactly that challenge. Ashley Hurd is the author of The Manager Method, a practical framework to lead, support, and get results. Her work goes beyond theory, offering managers a clear, usable approach to leading teams through ambiguity, difficult conversations, and high expectations without burning out themselves or their people. Ashley is a legal and HR leader with experience at organizations including McKinsey & Company and Yum Brands. She's an employment attorney, corporate leader, and podcast host who's trained more than 300,000 managers through live corporate events and the LinkedIn Learning platform. In this conversation, we'll explore what effective management really looks like when there's no playbook, how leaders can motivate teams without relying on authority, and how to have the tough conversations that actually move performance forward. Whether you're a first-time manager or a seasoned leader navigating constant change, this discussion will challenge how you think about leadership and give you tools you can use immediately. Ashley Hurd, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you, Roger. I'm so happy to be here.
Now, you've said that as a lawyer, you spent years being a situational janitor. I love that phrase. What do you mean by that? And how did that experience inform what you're doing today?
Well, those that have felt the feeling but maybe never heard it put that way probably resonates right away with them. But what often happened is, as a lawyer, as much as I like to think of myself as a colleague, people weren't really coming to me when things were going well. They would come to me about 17 steps after they should have, and things were an unmitigated disaster, or it was a lot of conflict. And my job often was to clean it all up in the quickest way. It was most perfect. And for me, I really felt stressful because I kept thinking to myself constantly I wish we'd talked a while ago or had a discussion, a more candid discussion, or maybe there's things I could have done at the outset, because now it's going to be a little bit hard to clean it up, especially if there was another lawyer involved. That made things a lot more difficult right. And a lot less collegial. But for me, it really framed it, because, sometimes you have the experiences of what you don't like to do that help to frame what you do like to do. And for me, I just kept thinking about that is, I like to work well with people. And sometimes that's having tough conversations, but I like to help people, organize the aisle and think about how to structure things rather than coming in to clean up the mess after the fact. And so it was really for me trying to move from the lawyer side of cleaning things up to thinking about not just how we prevent issues, but how if you flip your approach, you can actually leave and, I say, drive results without driving people out the door.
Right. So you emphasize practical strategies. What's broken about how most managers are trained today? There's a lot of training out there. It's apparently not working for a lot of people.
There is a lot of training. I still find so many organizations really don't offer manager training. And often how I hear that is an HR leader that kind of sheepishly says to me, we need to offer, we don't have manager training. And the first thing I say to people, whether you're in HR or CEO or you're a manager not getting training, is you're in company, maybe not good company, but you're in company because most people aren't getting it. And the people that are, often it's what I see is it is really theoretical. It's things like be strategic. And sometimes it uses, buzzwords that sound very fancy. It sounds like it may have been written by some of my former colleagues at McKinsey, and it sounds great, and it all sounds great, or at least it makes sense in the moment. And then you move on with life, and an employee comes to you and wants an answer, a real talk answer in the moment. And you think to yourself, what do I actually do and say in this situation? And so that to me is where the real gap is a disconnect about knowing generally what's important, but then actually knowing how to do it and ideas of what to say and how to find your own voice and approach in doing it.
Of course, a lot of people are put into manager positions, as you're alluding to, before they're really ready. There's an opening, and maybe they were really good as an individual performer, and so suddenly they're a manager, and they're kind of looking around saying, what now? So as you well know, the so-called imposter syndrome is a relatively new name for an age-old phenomenon. What's your advice to managers who suffer from that malady?
Well, one thing is, if you've heard that term, imposter syndrome, one thing I like to say is the two women who came up with that term, they actually like to call it, and they're in Atlanta, where I'm from. They did the research at Georgia State University, and they actually wish it were called imposter phenomenon. Because they say syndrome makes it sound like a sickness, like you've been infected with this. When a phenomenon, it often just happens. And sometimes it happens, you're all fine and good, excited. Like you've been tapped for a leadership position. Oftentimes that happens. And that says you're good at your job. You feel great about it. I call it the LinkedIn test. That some people, you are thinking about the time that you're going to announce that change on LinkedIn, publish it, and you're going to get all this kudos. You're going to show the people you used to work with, like this is who I am now, your family, your friends. People are so proud. And what you often hear is, congratulations. And then you get into the job and you think, this does not quite feel like the prize. This feels like quite a challenge. And how do I coach people, drive results, deal with the people issues? And so in that moment, I think one thing to know is it's really natural to have that happen. I find it to be anecdotally, and the research supports this, but much more common to have it than to be able to feel confident at every moment. And so just knowing you are in good company, and also to know that it's not just these first-time managers that have it, but really senior executives.
Sure.
And so I think the biggest thing I've seen is to talk about it. I actually think it's incredibly important for senior leaders at the top of the org chart, because a lot of those more junior managers or even mid-level, mid-career managers, they think that you are perfect and that you have it all figured out because of your title alone. And so when you talk honestly about the challenges that you face and how you get across them and ask other people for tips, it opens up the conversation so it makes people feel like they can actually have it and helps people realize, there's no one path to leadership. And at that point, it doesn't really matter how you got there. What often matters is what you uniquely bring, and you get to forge that path. And it can be a really cool opportunity once you get past this super normal self-doubt.
Sure. And titles don't necessarily make you capable of doing everything you need to do. Now, you advocate a pause, consider, act framework. Tell us about that and explain how a manager can use that framework to advantage.
I use this framework because what I've seen is, for better, for worse, whether you're reading leadership books, you're going through a training, what you actually take away from that often is just a few words. So I have to think about, okay, what are the words that really make it matter? And how can people have something in their mind that they can take into any people situation? And so pause, consider, act. The first step, pause, to me is the one that's most important because it rarely happens. And that's for people to literally take a beat, whether that's literally a second or sometimes it's thinking on things, days, weeks.
Right.
Because as a manager, again, goes hand in hand with things like imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, but this idea of you need to be decisive, you need to know the answers. And some of that's true. You got to make decisions. And that gets to the third step. So we'll jump ahead to that in a second. But but is to take a pause, because so many times people react. Someone makes a mistake. You are so irritated and you let that person know that in a way that maybe you regret a bit later down. Or people are asking for your input and you feel like you need to look like the expert. Those people that are in an organization that it feels like it's a race to reply first to every email will know that there's a lot of value sometimes in just taking that pause. And so the first step really is just to let people know, just think about that. Think about a pause and then use that to consider. And what I mean by consider is think about the other person on the side of that conversation or the other people. Again, as a manager, you have your perspective. We're all going to think about ourselves. But if you flip that and think, okay, my team member made a mistake. I need to have a conversation with them. I'm pausing. I listen to Leadership, so I'm taking this first step. I'm pausing. What do I possibly consider? How mad I am, or how to make them never do this again? And so two things. One is to consider is, well, before someone makes a mistake, talk to your team and say, let's talk about not if someone makes a mistake, but when you do, because it's going to happen. And again, this can be helpful to talk about something you did, how you had a mistake, how you learned. And so just consider the framing of that and how much that matters, and say, part of what we're doing here is trying to figure out how we make those mistakes less, but also when you do make a mistake, I don't want you spending far more time stressing about how to tell me about it than it's going to take for us to fix it. And so just thinking about that perspective. And then also when someone makes it, the consider, I say, you bring a lot when you're thinking about your team members. If I'm going to say to someone, who's your favorite team member? Who's your least favorite team member? Again, I don't say it out loud, but you may in your mind just have that naturally. And sometimes for good reasons, sometimes habits you've fallen into, but if instead in any situation you think, how would I want to be treated if I was on the other side of this conversation, or a loved one? I use over my shoulder, you can see a picture of my late grandmother, Gigi, who lived 96 wonderful years. And so sometimes I would literally think of her and think, okay, Gigi was not perfect. And when Gigi would make mistakes, how would I want someone to talk to her? I'd probably want them to ask her some questions before they come to things. And so the last, and you've paused, you've considered, but the last step is to act. Because the other trap I see people fall into, in addition to not taking time to pause, is you tell someone you're going to do something, you tell your team member, let me think on that, and then you never come back to it ever again. And so this team member thinks, okay, 17 years later, are they still thinking on this? Are they still reflecting on it? That's a lot of thought. But it's to actually do something about it. Have the conversation or take the action. Make sure you know what you've promised your team members that you'll tell them. And so just in any situation, pausing and all these three steps together can sometimes take 10 seconds. Sometimes they take more. But this is something that you can bring into anything as a people manager. And in the book, I go through actual specific examples of how to bring it to life.
Sure. Well, and what you're saying is that this pause, consider, act framework can be used in the moment or in anticipation of a moment. For example, if you're going to have a one-on-one accountability conversation with somebody tomorrow, you can be thinking that you should be thinking about it in advance.
Yes, you should. And accountability is a great one, a great example. Because sometimes it's pausing to consider, okay, how are we going to have this conversation? Because there's some words that you may need to do as a manager. You need to know how to give feedback. You need to know how to hold people accountable. Well, if you have a meeting with a team member and you started off saying, I want to give you some feedback, it may be very hard for that person to hear objectively the rest of what you're going to say because they're anticipating my boss is going to come in hot at me. And the same for accountability. And so considering to yourself, those words and those concepts are really important. But how can you say that in a matter that's actually heard? And why does it matter? Like, if you're reading this and thinking, okay, or listening to this, okay, this sounds like a bunch of fluff. But think about that from the flip side of times when someone said something to you and you really can't hear the message afterwards because you are just waiting for your turn to have right back at them.
When are you going to drop the hammer?
That's right.
Yeah. So, in an effective manager's relationships with coworkers, what role does empathy play? Well, you haven't used the word empathy, but that's kind of what you're talking about. And what does empathy actually look like in terms of observable behaviors?
So in the book, I actually talk about empathy and how there was a time that I was hired by an organization to lead a training session that we were calling Empathy in Action. And we were going through this and talking about these things. What is empathy? And so in talking about it, I'd say in real talk, things like empathy sometimes is again, considering the other person's perspective, considering how you'd want to be treated in a situation. And that doesn't mean you don't care about your team, but it can help you entirely to really think in advance of how it's going to be heard. And as we were going through this and talking about these things at the end, the HR team came back to me and said, we actually want to call this session something different. And okay, well, you're paying me. I'll call it pretty much whatever you want, but why? And they said, I don't know, just with the name of that session, like I think the people that probably need to hear it most either aren't going to sign up or are going to try to get out of a session called Empathy in Action. And I had to take my own advice and pause and consider, you know what, that's really true.
Yeah.
Because terms like empathy or psychological safety, you know, those are really...
It sounds kind of touchy-feely to some people.
It sounds touchy-feely. And I grew up in Kentucky, and I sometimes consider that as well. Some of the people I talk to who are real talk, who are some of the most empathetic people I know. But if I were to tell them, you are so empathetic, they would consider that an insult. And so oftentimes it really is considering the other person's perspective. It's not taking on everything that they're dealing with or trying to absorb all the stress of your team, but it really is understanding that how people communicate and how people feel treated at work impacts greatly their work results and even their life outside of work.
So when interviewing new team members, prospective team members, what questions should managers ask, and what clues should they be looking for that suggest that a candidate's potential fit on the team might be right?
One thing that I really think is important is before you think of team fit and culture fit is sometimes people think about that and think, okay, we have all these people. We want someone that's just like everybody else on the team.
No.
And that's right. So Roger, you tell me why, your reaction. How have you seen that come to life when people hire the duplicates?
I tell people if you have 10 people around a table and they agree on everything, you've got the wrong 10 people, because you're not going to come up with creative, innovative ideas if everybody agrees and nobody's comfortable with disagreeing.
Yes, it's true. And it takes a lot. I mean, that sounds so simple and common sense. But that being said, the next time, if you're hiring right now, listening to this, or the next time you hire, think about this temptation to hire what I call the mini me, or the person that reminds you of you. And we do fall in that trap. I mean, it's psychology shows it's very human nature to want to surround yourself. And that's why leadership is thinking intentionally, okay, but same. If nobody's disagreeing, well, then our customers may be disagreeing with us greatly, or we may be missing out on really important business results. And so it might feel good and we can nod and save time on our meeting, but we're not really doing what's necessarily important. And so I think I'm a proponent of really thinking about what the role entails. I mean, I know there's all these questions in the book about, asking somebody these theoretical questions of, how many people I live in Atlanta, how many people do you think have flown through the Atlanta airport this year, and how would you figure that out? If someone is going to be interviewing for a job at the Atlanta airport or Delta Airlines or something, like, sure, that matters, and I understand what people are getting at, but I just think we've gotten so far out about stopping to consider how that thinks in the moment. And so many, if someone's interviewing to be in a call center, or someone's thinking about you're interviewing someone to serve food at your restaurant or a corporate job, immediately some of their thought internally is, I can't wait to tell my friends about this. They don't take that as an experience. They're thinking about, I have no idea. And you're not even going to necessarily get their best work. But if instead you talk to your team, one of the things I actually really recommend is talking to your team and saying, what are questions you think we can be asking to really find out if someone can do the job, or to make sure it's someone that would give us opinions that we're not considering, and do that in a way that's productive, not, just disagreement for the sake of disagreement. And so I actually think pausing to talk with your team before you're hiring and rethinking, especially if you've had the same old job description and questions for a long time, that's where you can really make the process more effective and look for not perfection, but look for patterns that are really relevant to what the person's actually going to do. And I actually encourage managers that are hearing this and saying, okay, we're trying to get a sense of how you think, and I'm not going to ask you some question that's unrelated, like how many people are flying through this airport, but I do want you to get a sense of what work is like and how you'd approach it. And so given that kind of explanation and asking a relevant question that maybe you've created with the help of your team, you are communicating transparency, trust, all of these things that as an organization help to bring that person aboard and help them as they actually do the work.
Well, of course, the job candidate is being asked questions by the interviewer, and sometimes the interviewer forgets that the job candidate may have some questions of his or her own. I always thought it was a good idea to invite the candidate to ask questions, and you can learn a lot about the candidate through the questions that the candidate asks. It needs to be a conversation rather than a grilling or an interrogation.
I agree. What's a good question, if you can think of one that you were asked, like when you were hiring someone, or that you've heard a candidate ask, if you can think of one top of mind?
I always appreciated it if they would ask some version of, tell me of a recent case where the team was faced with a particular challenge and there was disagreement on the team. Tell me about that conversation and how you, as a team, came to a conclusion, and then tell me about how that conclusion bore fruit. That a question like that can tell you quite a bit about, or at least the answer can tell you quite a bit about what's going on in the organization. And if the interviewer struggles with answering that should tell the candidate something.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And one thing I'll add to this is, there's questions like that are really important. And when you hear that, I think that's great. That's impressive. There are so many questions that are almost this no man's land. The employer's not bringing them up, so the interviewer's not bringing them up, and the interviewee is absolutely not going to bring them up, but they have to do greatly with whether someone would accept the job and how they feel about it when they start. And so one thing I found to be really helpful, and I talk about in the book, is thinking about what are the things that people really need to know. I mean, some of these things, like not just time off, like, in our paperwork, you get 10, 15 days off a year. Those outside, those listeners globally will say 10, 15, come on, like 25, 30. Like, okay, absolutely. But it's also, what is it like when you take time off? Because sometimes you join a team and people take time off, but your time off is really off-ish, and that's kind of the way it is. And other teams, you take time off and you have coverage and conversations, and people are able to travel without their laptop or without their work. And that experience varies wildly. And I encourage in that first scenario, if people can't really take time off, as I say in the book, is to really consider things. If you wouldn't want to tell a candidate what it's really like, consider if it's actually driving your existing team out the door or impacting how they work. But thinking about that, and I have a list of some of the things to think about that. Again, it's important to really communicate that proactively sometimes, because some of those things that matter most to someone, whether they'll accept the job or your top candidate, how they'll do the job, or if they'll have a bad surprise when they start, how can you communicate that rather than making them ask? And so the questions they ask are the ones like you suggested, like really digging into team dynamics and success. And so for me, that's the best cadence of an interview, where it's, more valuable questions back and forth, but the interviewer or other team members are able to talk about the real deal, so that the candidate, when they start on day one, they feel like it's exactly as it was described in the process.
Sure. If I were a candidate, I would want to know, what's it like here if you manage up? In other words, what kind of relationship do people have with their own manager? Are they able to challenge the manager's thinking without being scolded or put down? And there are lots of ways to ask that question, but if I were a candidate and I didn't have a good feel about the response I was getting to that question, I wouldn't be coming back to that organization.
It's very, very, very true. And I think understanding how you can ask that as a candidate, and then understanding and really thinking personally as a manager, because some of that's important. I mean, giving and getting feedback is not just something that your team members need to know. It's something that's especially important at every level of the leadership ladder. And making sure that people feel like they can ask you, they can push back on things, they can share their ideas. Those are, and data consistently shows this, but also just from a human nature perspective, it changes entirely how people work and what gets done.
Sure. Well, let's switch gears here just a little bit. Let's talk about something that's on everybody's mind, it seems like today, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence seems to be everywhere. What's your quick take on how best to manage AI in today's workplace? What are you seeing? What are you advising?
Well, I think every organization, and if you're not the CEO and you're saying, I can't make all these decisions for my organization, okay, my team, everybody on your team should know three things. And this is really about any topic, but especially about AI. One is what's expected, two is what's allowed, and three is what's possible. And what I mean is, there are some conversations about AI, and I've had more and more conversations about performance reviews in AI, and generally not individual managers coming and telling me this, but them sometimes saying, our organization is now including this on our performance reviews, like AI proficiency. And I say, okay, well, if I'm a team member, what does that mean? And a manager saying, I'm scrambling to figure that out myself. And so that's part of managing up, is being able to push up and say, okay, but how are we going to articulate that? And some of those three questions can be helpful to do it, because what's expected can be what tools can you use, what can't you use, all over the place. If you're not having very candid and very structured conversations around AI, then you have team members that have never used it because they have no idea how to use it or use it effectively. You have other team members that are using it and pumping your confidential information in it in ways that would drive your lawyers crazy. And so thinking about what's expected, what are those general guardrails, but then also what's allowed and then what's possible. And so in the what's allowed and what's possible, one of the things I think can be helpful is to find people that are using AI in really good ways. For me, I think the power in AI, I truly believe the power in AI isn't making us look better. Like, yeah, you can use it. Oh, clean up my email. Like, oh, that sounds good. Oh, how do I ask a question about managing up in an interview? You could put it into ChatGPT and probably get some suggestions that are pretty good. But the real value to me is using it to actually be better. So as a manager, I mean, that's one of the prompts that I actually, for those just really getting started with ChatGPT, is to say, or other AI tools, but I'm a manager in this function. How can I use AI to not just look better, but be better? I mean, literally asking that and getting started, but things like, what are scenarios I'm going to face? If I'm a new manager, what are things I should know? What are some of the questions I should ask, and some support I can realistically give? Again, you don't need to give, and you shouldn't be giving confidential personal info.
Sure.
But some of this back and forth can help to build your muscles, because while AI is definitely not a diary, it's nor an encyclopedia, it's not a private source. It's oftentimes being trained for everybody else. And encyclopedia AI, if you ask it a fact, frequently it will confidently tell you a fact that is completely wrong. But people sometimes can feel comfortable in using AI in a way that asking questions that, if you're going to ask questions about your career, your development, the family members you may feel most comfortable asking, they all have their own opinions. Your leaders, they have their own opinions, but sometimes AI can be, well, not a fully objective source for sure, but it can help to have that back and forth conversation and be an outlet that people do feel more comfortable asking those back and forth questions.
It can help you think about things that really didn't occur to you.
It can. And I will say, for those that have used ChatGPT is in particular, is the world's most helpful yet annoying colleague, because no matter what you ask, it always wants to do more. It was, I was out
exactly.
I was out at LinkedIn Learning, and I was giving a course on I'm making a new course on how to use AI to help set OKRs, like, objectives and key results kind of. And I was asking, okay, what are 3 questions you can ask in this meeting? Of course, AI gives you 3 questions, and then it says, well, would you like me to give you 5 to 8 instead? No, you got to tell it to stop, because you could spend an endless, you'd never go to sleep if you just let it. So it has some limits. So you got to tell it to pipe down.
Should I set it to music? What would you really like?
Exactly. Would you like a 1-page slide? Would you like a picture of yourself doing
That's right. Exactly.
It's like, no, I'm good, but I'm good, but thank you.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
So in many organizations, meetings are a major time suck. How do you coach people on how to make the most of their meetings?
One is to think about the purpose of meetings. And so one inclination people say is, we're not going to have any meetings whatsoever. Okay, well, sometimes the way that plays out, especially if you're thinking about one-to-one meetings, so let's talk about that first, is one-to-one time. If people aren't finding it valuable, then The answer generally to me is not to cancel it entirely, because organizations I see or managers that say, I don't have one-on-ones, people know where to find me if they need me. You may say that. That's a lot easier to say than it to actually come to life. And so your team members may have this running list of 17, 27, 37 things that they've been waiting to talk to you about. And then you can feel stressed because that open door, you got to shut it sometimes. And
sure,
everyone's literally knocking at you, or you get Teams chats, hey, do you have a quick second? And so it can feel stressful. So
there's no such thing as a quick second, by the way.
There's never been a quick second. But so having time with your team members does more than just get the work done. It also shows all of those things, like that transparency, like the communication. It shows that you're there, and it helps you to build those relationships that really do matter. And so just knowing, no matter what, when you're meeting with your team members, there is value in it before either of you say a word, especially if you set the time and you show up on time. Because the flip to that is sometimes you'll have managers that say, well, I have a 30-minute meeting. I showed up. Yeah, I was 17 minutes late. And they show up and tell their direct report, well, I was meeting with XYZ person who's higher on the org chart. And you say that to your team member because you want, to give them excuse. That person on the other side of it is probably thinking something like, okay, well, I know how important I am compared to that person. So
right.
So again, some of this is the pause, consider, act about. And in the book, I talk about what you can say sometimes to those senior leaders when appropriate, to be able to leave that and go to your one-on-one, or to help preserve those more when you can. But so just knowing from one-on-one meetings or team meetings, really think about what's the purpose of it. Sometimes it's spacing them out. Like if you have a weekly team meeting and it just really feels unnecessary with all sorts of people in all different roles, and team meetings in particular can feel like it's like parallel play with toddlers. Like it feels like a bunch of little one-on-ones where everyone goes around the room and everyone else ignores and, does their own work until it's time for them to speak and nobody else is listening to what they're saying. And so thinking about the values. So some of the ideas I give are things like, for a team meeting, having a joint team meeting with the other team. So in organizations, there's some functions that can have more natural conflict than others. Like think of your sales team and accounting. Sales wants to sign the contract, accounting wants XYZ, or procurement or information security. And so often what happens is the leaders of these teams, it becomes very us versus them. It doesn't really feel like an organization. It feels like you're fighting each other. When at the end of the day, accounting needs sales to book the deal, so accounting can still have a job, and sales needs accounting to do their job so that things don't become undone after someone signs a line and all the work they did hard for, the client's not going to pay because things weren't buttoned up. And so sometimes having a joint team meeting and not having the usual suspects of the heads of function talk, generally in platitudes, but have two people that do the work, an accountant or maybe a legal or somebody that talks with an account executive, and they talk about something they've had recently, where they have seemed to have conflict and how they got over it, and where they figured out, okay, this is what we can do to make things more efficient moving forward. This is what we can agree on, but also to understand the challenges that each other have. Because often in organizations, it does feel not just like team meetings as parallel play, but there are departments and it just seems like there's animosity. And at the end of the day, that doesn't help anybody, but the managers can really create the culture of collaboration. So thinking about that, of giving the opportunity for teams to come together periodically, or even on your own team, one thing that can be helpful is giving people opportunity to speak up. Again, sometimes team meetings have the usual suspects that say it all, but to have members of your team rotate talking about something just for a few minutes about something that they know a lot about. Sometimes that's a professional, that's a process. Like you may have somebody that does an assistant that just brings such levels of care, and have that person talk about their career and how they develop that. They may have to think really hard because it comes naturally to them, but talk about the impact it has and have other people chime in of how they've seen that come to life. Because that can take 5 minutes, if not that, if not less than that. But you've now given this person, who may not always have a voice or feel like they've earned a seat to speak, they get to share something that feels common sense but makes a world of difference. And you can also have people even talk at times about like a personal topic, like someone that's really, really into something, and share about it just for a couple minutes. Again, without taking away from the whole meeting, this gives people an opportunity to practice public speaking in a more safe environment, and also builds those connections to see the people behind, the colleague that I need something from.
And all of this helps deal with potential silo mentality between departments and even functions within a department.
Yeah, it does. And I do think that, technology, as I said, technology is more and more coming into our lives. We both agree on that. But it is why connection is more needed than ever. And there can be such loneliness when you feel like if you're a remote worker, or even if you go to the office and you sit at your cube, or you sit at your office, or you sit in your space and you just feel so alone. I mean, I still have connections with people that I worked at, sometimes because I learned something about them and I'm still following along with it, or we just happened to have a conversation. And it changed entirely the way that you work, but again, also the way you feel coming into work.
Well, relationships are important. I exchanged emails yesterday with a colleague I worked with 40 years ago, and there's still that relationship because it was so good in the moment. And if I say so myself, we did good work, I think partially because of that relationship. Let's talk about delegation a minute. Delegation can help a manager get more done while giving others the opportunity to learn and grow in their work. Unfortunately, many managers seem to forget that effective delegation requires some careful upfront communication on their part. Tell us, if you would, about the delegation checklist that you suggest for managers.
So I really do think about delegation as so important for the manager and for the team. And the biggest resistance I see is the manager that says, well, nobody can do it like I can, or it'll be so much quicker if I do it.
Exactly.
Or but if they start doing it, then that's what I'm known for. And so if I'm passing these things off, this is job security for me. And so I don't want to do that. And so there's so much hesitation. But so in thinking about the value for yourself, like, yeah, you may do that. But I think most of us, if we were to look at the things we do in a day and you have a team that could support you, there's a lot that would probably be better served if somebody else can do it well. And so the job is, okay, how do I teach someone else to do it well? And knowing that the second of those questions I said, or the second pushback, which is, it's so much faster if I do it. That is absolutely true for probably 100% of things that you're thinking about delegating. But over time, what you think about is, okay, but I keep doing this, and I keep doing this every day and week. So if you take some investment at the outset, a lot of this is to think about first, what really matters. So stripping your own particularities out of it a little bit, because that's a trap I see people fall into of, this is how I do it, this is how I like it, this is just my thing. Mm-hmm. But knowing that when you're going to hand it off to somebody, they are probably not going to do it exactly like you. And so thinking about what really matters. And sometimes things really matter, like regulatory, like you're in a healthcare environment, patient care, okay, you got to do it this way, great. Other times things matter for a way that, okay, my team member does it, but I need to give them a heads up about this, because as they're trying it for the first time, if they format this in a different way, or they don't use this phrase, well, they're doing this for senior leaders, so nobody's going to listen to them. They're going to sound like an idiot. And so really think about setting your team up for success for some of what absolutely matters, some of what matters because of how people will perceive it. And then also, what are areas that they have to try? And so as part of this is, okay, what are ways I can stage gate it along the way? So if you have a team member, sometimes it's, okay, I'm about to work on something. I'm going to pause, and rather than doing that myself right now, I have a one-on-one with my team member here in a little bit. I'm going to see if they can help this. And so what I'm going to do is walk them through this document. Or maybe for the first time, you are going to do it. But you have them sit with you when you're editing something, or you're writing an email, or you're doing something. You show them. Then you give them an opportunity to try it themselves with some of that support. And over time, it is that level of transition. And so the checklist goes in detail kind of about how you can do this. But one step that is incredibly important is, as you're delegating something, you may have done this, I've listened to Leadership, okay, I'm doing this, I'm delegating, we've been practicing this. It's really important to think about the other people that will hear or see this. So whether people are going to see this on some report, or whether you're bringing somebody in to do a presentation, let's say it is senior leadership. Before that, and before the person's in the room, telling those other senior leaders, this is the first time they're trying something. And I think all of us can remember what it was like the first time we tried something, or the first time we did this. And, I've gone through these steps to prepare them. But again, we feel really confident about how they're going to do it. But whether they blow it out of the park, if they do, let's be candid about that. If they don't, let's hold off on any criticism, because as you know, one of the hardest things to recover from is when you did poorly, or you're afraid you did poorly, which most people are going to think, even if they do a good job. But if these other leaders come in and you just feel totally beaten down. And so just reminding people of that from that human lens, because that can help, because other leaders start doing that for their teams. Like, oh, I should probably delegate that, and I should give this heads up to everybody else as well. And so that can help to make it most successful as well.
And it's important for managers to remember that part of their role is to develop other people, not just give assignments.
Yes, it's true. You are having ripple effects on the work that people do and the growth that they have in their careers. As you look at the 4 coaches in the college football championship semifinals, and all 4 of them were proteges of Nick Saban, for example. And you hear this of coaches, or you see people in the trajectory that people take. When you are a leader, you have to really intentionally think about moving from just the to-do list of today to how can we use this? Sometimes it's the thing, you still do the things on the to-do list of today, but how can we use this to develop the team members of tomorrow and next year and really build that on?
I know of, and you do too, of excellent leaders who can hearken back to their earlier days in their career, and they can remember a single conversation with the manager that made all the difference for them.
Do you have one top of mind?
Well, I do. I've said this before on this podcast, but early in my career, for most of my career, I've been a consultant and a coach. But early in my career, I was a journalist, and my editor at one time was Jim Lehrer. And at that time, nobody had heard of Jim Lehrer. He later was at PBS and was the only one, probably who nobody will ever break this record, who moderated 12 presidential debates. He was enormously respected. Well, he was a young editor and I was a young reporter, and he taught me how to do interviews. And, I thought I was doing a pretty good job with interviews, but he taught me how to listen. And he told me one day, he said, when you ask a question, listen to the answer and then count to 5 silently before you jump in with the next question. And I said, Jim, that's going to seem like an eternity. And I said, yeah, it really is. He said, what do you think is going to happen? I said, well, the person I'm interviewing is probably going to jump in and elaborate on their answer, or maybe even go in a different direction. He said, that's exactly what will happen. So I tried it that day, and I was an investigative reporter. And by definition, an investigative reporter is usually talking with people who don't want to be talking with a reporter. So I tried it that day, and I came back to the newsroom, and he was on the other side of the newsroom, and he waved at me to come over to report to him. And I said, across the newsroom, I said, I never got past 3. So I was counting silently, and the respondent, my source, would jump in, and they were great interviews, much better than I was doing before. So I look back at that one tip that Jim Lehrer gave me, and it helped me be a better reporter. It helped me be a better consultant, a better university professor, a better parent, a better grandparent, a better husband. So, managers can have an impact.
Yes, it is so true. And I love how you talk about the impact on family, because I know some places, workplaces say we're like a family. And then there's all the discussion about that of, you're not going to put your family on a performance plan or fire your family, or maybe use that terminology at least. But while families and workplaces can all be complicated, a lot of the things, even like the pause, consider, act formula, I try to bring it into how I parent my kids. They're 11 and 14. And, I know every day counts. And I'm not always going to be perfect. They will be the first to tell you that, but trying to come back and work with your team. And so in the book, a lot of what I do is I do not come from a place of judgment. Even as a lawyer, I knew when those people were coming to me to janitize their situation or situationalize their janitorial mess that people often likely had a big pit in their stomach before they came to me, because nobody wanted to talk to legal, despite the fact that I tried to be very friendly and approachable. But nobody wants to be talking to that function. And so, I try to take that, everything I've done. There are so many leaders that have never gotten practical training. And so knowing, wherever people are, you can always recover from. If you've been a micromanager, you can adjust that. It takes change. It takes conversation, candid conversation. But to me, it is really important to think about the impact that people have at work and in their life.
So, Ashley, what's the most common mistake leaders seem to make when giving critical feedback?
The most common mistake, I would say, is silence.
Yeah.
So, and they're not just counting to 5 to listen to what the other person has to say. They never have the conversation. And the reason for that often is what I've seen is that it feels mean. It feels hard. Sometimes you're in the middle of a really critical time and you don't want to make someone, feel down when you need their work. Other times people may know, well, this person will cry. I don't want them to cry. I don't like that. It makes me uncomfortable as a manager. So I'll hold off on that for now. Maybe I'll put it in their performance review, or you're afraid the person will quit and we can't afford to lose someone right now. I hear all of those things. And generally what I hear is like protectionist. People care about their team members. I don't want to make them upset. I can't afford to have our team a person down. But if you think about that and phrase it the other way is you have a team member that needs to have this conversation. And there may be 5, 6 managers before that should have had the exact same conversation. You can't do anything about that. But you can have it now. And so whether it's pause, consider, act, and think about, okay, thinking about that and how important it is to finally have that conversation. How would I want to have that conversation to me if 7 people have thought this about me and nobody's said it? And so thinking about that, but then acting and doing it. And so to me, it's generally not the fear that so many people have of doing or saying the wrong thing. It's the silence that they actually do because they're afraid of it going wrong.
I've always thought that it's easier to have that tough conversation if you have another conversation long before the need. For example, when you have a new team member and you're delegating an assignment, a responsibility to that person. I think it's important to have some mutual understanding about what the expectations are. What are the metrics? What are the key performance indicators? And get agreement on that. And then if there's performance that varies from that mutual expectation, you can refer back to that conversation. You're not jumping on somebody with some new information. You can go back to what they agreed to and then talk about the gap between what they're doing and what they agreed to do. And that conversation is easier. And to me, it comes across as more friendly.
Completely. It's a setting expectations again, and it's in making it both ways and saying, if I'm explaining something and it's not right, first I'll pause to think, okay, is this not my way of doing it or does it really need correction? And we'll talk about that. But also on the flip side, if I'm telling you, all right, we're going to meet about this weekly, and then all of a sudden I'm canceling our weekly meetings, then it's on me to own that. But if I don't, I want you to say, this is what I need, or I sent you this for review. I don't want you to be afraid to follow up to me or have of those. And so I totally agree. And then when you do it, you have the conversation and you're given that feedback saying, okay, I told you I'd give this feedback. And also remembering the second trap I see, because with critical feedback, I really do see the biggest gap is silence. Again, I will say, especially having been a lawyer, there's sometimes people give critical feedback and they should have been silent instead of what they said. But the vast majority of the time, it's that people aren't saying things. But what people are silent about as well is sometimes the positive feedback. And so telling somebody, if somebody does a really good job, telling them what they did and how it mattered and asking them, how did you do this? How could you potentially train others? That positive recognition, that's often missing just as much.
And the really good managers I've observed are pretty good about requesting feedback on their own performance. They might be talking about a direct report's performance, but then they'll ask something about what could I do differently? How could I be helpful?
Yep.
And really listen. Don't just throw it out there as a feel-good question. Really listen and take it seriously.
It's true.
So what's the best way to re-engage a burned-out team or team member? We hear a lot about burnout these days.
We hear a lot about burnout. And to me, burnout is very similarly to a word of toxic, which is when I hear those things, you think, what does that mean? Burnout, I mean, there's sometimes when it's people that they really don't need to be in the workplace right now, but they need time away to really recover from. Sometimes they're going through a personal challenge that makes it harder to get the work done. And so as a manager, I do think part of what's important is talking with other leaders and talking with your HR team to have these conversations about what are the signs that you see of someone that really needs help and how do we do that productively. But also, let's say you have a team member that's not to the point of burnout that they need to take leave and have those resources or the employee assistance program if you have access to that. But it's looking and really thinking to yourself, okay, if I have someone that just seems super stressed out, and oftentimes as a manager, how this comes to you is, well, this person, either they shut down entirely, we're remote, they never have their camera on. If we do, they just seem irritated all the time.
Yeah.
Or I have the team member that's always complaining to me about their workload, and I don't even know what they do all day. It is pausing to have that conversation and find out what's really going on. It's important how you frame that conversation, because if you have someone that comes to you and says, I'm burnt out, because you can go on Instagram or TikTok and see all these videos about burnout, or they hear that. And as a manager saying, okay, all right, well, how do you think we all feel? You just got to get through it. Now, that's probably not going to be received so well. But if you say, and on the other side, if you have this approach where you say, okay, well, take all the time you need, that's right. That, and you're not doing any favors either, because then all of a sudden that's the situation where I'd have managers say, well, this person's I told them to take time off. They've been gone for 3 weeks. I said, well, okay. Well, again, wish we'd had that conversation earlier, because threading it in the middle sometimes can say, my job is to support, there's work we have to get done. But my job is to talk through with you and understand, how do you prioritize? What needs to get done? What can move? Sometimes we have to work more or do more, but when we can, we want to make sure it's reasonable. My job is to make sure work gets done without burning you out in the process. And so let's realistically talk about it. And that's where, I've found sometimes in those conversations, you find people are doing things they don't really need to be doing, or they don't understand how to prioritize. And so that's where I really do think of conversation communication, and a really important thing to say as a manager is, again, I can't promise anything and what we'll do about it, but I want to get your input and think on it so that we can make sure that what we're giving you, the workload, it's realistic, it makes sense. Where there's a challenge, it's not an impossible one, and let's figure that out together. I mean, I can think of personally so many times I was on the employee side of that and going to my leader. And sometimes I was a manager, but going still to my own boss. And I felt, I wouldn't have probably called it burnout, but I would have said overwhelmed, confused, stressed out. And I walked away from that one every single time. And I had all sorts of different managers, but I'd walk away from that feeling so much more clear on what to do next. And generally that one-on-one conversation, it didn't always involve taking things off my plate. Often it was really thinking about getting some answers, talking out loud about what I was thinking. And so I do think the conversations are a great place to start.
They apparently gave you some context, and that helps.
It does.
So, final question here. What habits seem to separate managers who grow into leaders from those who plateau? What's the difference?
I think the biggest step I've seen for managers, or the biggest habit for managers, is the ones that keep trying to learn. And I do think the more that you grow, sometimes you feel like the more that you need to know, and you have that already. And so you stop asking those questions. You feel like you can't ask those questions. And so I think as you grow, it can be even more important, because you look at some senior executives and you will say, when's the last time someone asked, not just tell me what to do, but asked more generally for your perspective, for your thought. Oftentimes they'll tell you they don't. They don't. I wish more people would ask me, and I would happy to have their thoughts. Or even as a senior executive, asking people, you don't have to look to mentorship for people above you. Asking team members, what am I missing? Because especially as you're growing in responsibility and team size as a leader, you start to be removed from the day-to-day work that really matters. And so remembering how important it is to be approachable, have conversations. I mean, the best example I'll give of this is Greg Creed, who I worked at Yum Brands. David Novak was the first CEO of Yum Brands. Greg Creed had succeeded him, and Greg Creed was from Australia originally. I left Yum to move with my family to Sydney, Australia for my husband's job. And while I was there, I'd worked for KFC as the brand, but while I was there, Taco Bell returned to Australia. And we were in New South Wales, Sydney, but Taco Bell came to Queensland. And I had a girlfriend who, she was pregnant, and she and her husband went on a baby moon to Queensland. And while they were there, they went to a Taco Bell that had just opened up. And she sent me a picture of this receipt, and it was hilarious. It looked like it could feed 17 people. And they were from the States originally. So she was like, oh, it felt like home. But she sent me this receipt for, I don't know, $70 US, let's say. I mean, it was crazy. And the first thing I thought of was to send a copy of that to Greg Creed. And I emailed it. I sent the picture. I sent it to Greg Creed, and told him. I reminded him who I was. Had no idea if he'd remember me. Used to see him in the cafeteria, other places. He immediately responded and laughed and said, "Boy, with tickets like that, we're sure to succeed. This is amazing. All fantastic. Love this so much." And and it was him responding in this story. It's just, when you think about yourself as a leader and thinking about how it matters to be approachable doesn't just mean that people are going to come to you and complain or bring you their problems. And that's a fear a lot of managers have. And it's oftentimes what team members will do. And so, in the book, there's all these strategies to talk about how to, create a team that can help to sometimes solve their own challenges at times, but knowing how much it matters to be approachable. Because when you're approachable, that doesn't just mean the bad things. That means people are going to bring you their ideas. Can I try this? Oh, I'd love to do this. And you are going to create an environment that does have those results, but also is a place that people work at and want to be at and talk about how much they love their jobs.
It reminds me of one of my clients who was telling me about, he was a CEO of a major corporation, and he was telling me about the great mentoring he had over his career. And I said, "Do you have any mentors now?" And I was thinking, maybe some external coach. He said, "Oh, yeah, I've got a couple of them." I said, "Really? Who are they?" They were people a couple of rungs down the corporate ladder from him. And he would invite them in. They'd have lunch around his table in his office, and he would have them mentor him on how to be a better CEO. And he said, I've done that throughout my whole career, except for my first job, because for my first job, there wasn't anybody further down on the rung. But as I grew in my career, there always was. And he said, it's amazing what I've learned. And it's amazing how helpful it has been for people to alert me to potential blind spots.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very smart of him.
I love that. And I love that we ended on that.
Well, Ashley Hurd, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. This conversation reminds us that great management isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating clarity, trust, and momentum when conditions are far from perfect. In a world where managers are navigating constant change, tough conversations, and rising expectations, your framework offers something rare, a grounded, human-centered approach that actually works. If leaders take one idea from this conversation into their next meeting, their next one-on-one, or their next difficult decision, I hope it's this. Management is not about control. It's about enabling people to do their best work, even when the path forward is not fully clear. To learn more about Ashley and her work, visit her website at managermethod.com. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with your team, your network, or anyone else who's ready to lead with more confidence, more courage, and more impact. And be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast offers. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.